Live from CNN Atlanta, this is Connect the World.
Welcome. This hour, the coronavirus slowing but far from stopping, and they are feeling the burn in New Hampshire. Also, we are along the Turkish-Syrian border. I'm Lynda Kinkade. Welcome to 2 hours of Connect the World. Good to have you with us. Well, of course, the big story today is the number of new coronavirus infections. It is growing, that even as Chinese officials insist that the rate of infections is slowing. Now, there are currently more than 45,000 confirmed cases worldwide, with more than 1,100 deaths. The vast majority of cases, almost all the deaths, are in mainland China. Scattered new cases are popping up elsewhere, and the virus has been reported in more than 24 countries and territories. So just how deadly is this strain of the coronavirus? Well, you can see here the estimated 2% mortality rate, much higher than the seasonal flu here in the United States, but far lower than the SARS and the MERS epidemics earlier this century. Well, in the past 24 hours, another 40 cases have cropped up on board that quarantine cruise ship in Japan. And that brings the number of confirmed cases on the Diamond Princess to 175. Now, crew members are pleading for outside help. They say they've been forced to interact with potentially infected passengers without the protection they need. Well, it's a very different mood on this ship. You can hear the clapping there. Passengers on board the Westerdam held a party after they found out that they'll be allowed to disembark in Cambodia. Now, no one on board that ship is showing any symptoms of the coronavirus, but several countries denied entry to the ship after it departed from Singapore last month. Well, let's bring in the team. Our David Culver is in Beijing for us. He's been on the story since the first reports of this outbreak. Also, Matt Rovers is in Yokohama with a look at life on board that quarantine cruise ship. Good to have you both with us. Matt, I want to start with you because this is the biggest cluster of cases of the coronavirus outside China. We're not talking about another country. We're talking about a cruise ship. And thankfully, for those on board, it seems that that quarantine will end next week.
Yeah, it will be, but it's interesting, Lynda, because, we're talking about all these people on the cruise ship and we're talking a lot about this quarantine, but there are some 1,400 people or so on this cruise ship right now who are not under quarantine. That would be the crew who are taking care of the roughly 2,500 people who are under the quarantine. Those people who are remaining in their rooms, they need to be fed, things need to be clean, laundry needs to be done, and that's falling on the crew. And the crew has told us that they are scared that because they're not under quarantine, they're not receiving the same protections, Lynda. It seems like there's a tale of the have and the have-nots on board this ship.
We are doing everything in our power to maximize your comfort during your extended stay with us.
A Wednesday announcement for passengers aboard the Diamond Princess as the captain seeks to reassure them all is okay, saying the air on board is clean. But amidst his crew, there is palpable fear that the virus is spreading. CNN spoke with a crew member aboard the ship, Sonali Tucker. Speaking behind a mask, her message is urgent. Are you concerned that the virus is spreading amongst the crew right now?
Yes, it is, because the number of crew members who are infected is also increasing now.
At least 5 crew members have already tested positive for the virus. Sonali said she's had a fever and chills since Monday. She says her boss told her to stop work and stay in her cabin. She's scared. She's got it too. And how does that make you feel?
We just want to get back home safe without this infection. That's all we want.
When we talked, she'd been waiting to see a doctor for 2 days. Meanwhile, about 1,000 of her colleagues kept working because there's over 2,600 passengers on board that have been put in mandatory quarantine by Japan's government, forced to stay in their rooms most of the day. But the ship still needs to run, so the crew works side by side, wearing masks and gloves, though Sonali says mealtime is most dangerous.
So we all remove our masks and gloves when we are eating, so we are all sitting in the same place and having food, and it can spread.
CNN has spoken to multiple infectious disease experts who express skepticism that the current quarantine system is the best way to contain the virus.
I think a lot of thought went into what to do with the passengers, but it puts the crew at increased risk.
Japanese authorities continue to defend their actions, saying they believe anyone who tests positive contracted the virus before the quarantine went into effect. Anyone who tests positive is brought off the ship and sent to local hospitals. Earlier this week, we asked a Japanese health official if the crew was safe. Is everyone on board the ship being treated the same way? What do you say to their concerns?
We are trying to treat all the people equally. However, we also know that crew members don't have private rooms like the passengers have, and they still have to work and help people on the ship. So it's not all equal. However, we're giving everyone on the ship guidelines for prevention.
Princess Cruises saying it's following Japan's quarantine guidelines, saying the, quote, Japan Ministry of Health has been the lead defining the testing protocols for all guests and crew. But the fact is, as long as Japan continues to insist on quarantining passengers on board the ship, the danger will remain because the crew has to keep working. There's mixed reaction from passengers on board.
The crew are being so good, and I know they're worried as well.
I do not feel the quarantine is working. It's a failed quarantine.
During our phone call with Sonali on Wednesday, she had to hang up. Are you still there? A doctor had finally come to test her for the virus. She'll find out soon if she tests positive. How do you feel now that the doctors came to your room?
I'm still scared because I don't want it to be tested.
The Diamond Princess will remain in quarantine until February 19th. Until then, the crew will keep working, more exposed to the virus than the passengers they're taking care of. And so we don't know exactly when she'll get her test results back, but, you know, we were texting earlier tonight, and Sonali was saying, look, even if it comes back negative, that means I have to go back to work, and then I'm working with people who might be positive. And as long as I'm not quarantined, I'm still scared. So you can understand, Lynda, you know, the difficulties facing this crew and their situation here. It's really tough.
Yeah, certainly frightening for the crew. No doubt, very difficult conditions. If you just stand by for us, Matt, I want to bring in David because we know in China that people that took the Lunar New Year holiday got an extended break. They are now set to return to work next week. There's some 160 million travellers that are set to return. What sort of measures will be undertaken to ensure that we don't see a surge in cases?
Right, that's a huge concern, Lynda, because you've got to put this in context as to when all of this has started and is continuing, and that is around the Lunar New Year. So this is when you have the largest human migration annually, and you've got hundreds of millions in this region who generally travel. Well, that was the case right before the holiday. Many of those people left major cities like Beijing, like Shanghai, and went to their home provinces, and then the lockdown measures started to go in effect. And after that, we realized many people were still stuck in their home provinces. Some, quite literally, still in those lockdown zones. Others just simply don't have the transportation to get back. Well, now that they're starting up again with businesses, they say February 18th is likely when everything will come back online, though it'll likely be a trickle. You're going to have 160 million, as you point out, flooding back into those cities. And so the concern is going to be the congregation of masses, right? Because that obviously is putting people close to one another. It's possible exposure of this virus from one person to another. It raises those concerns. And one thing they are doing is popular to get around here by rail, but they're going to cut some of the tickets that generally people use, the standing room only ones, which are quite popular. They're saying that's not going to be allowed because they simply don't want people face to face for that long of a duration. And they're also going to be having a lot of businesses still continuing with the reality of working from home. I mean, that's something that they simply have not gotten rid of altogether because folks, quite frankly, are a bit terrified about that. But there's also going to be a trickle of some of the migrant workers back in. It's not going to happen all at once, Lynda, because some of these workers, many of whom we've spoken with, they don't have a job to come back to right now. In fact, one says that the family she worked for, they were evacuated. They're not around, so she has nowhere to go. And the folks here, the local authorities in particular, are actually outside of some of these residential complexes, and they are checking to make sure whether or not you have a permanent residence to go back to. And you have to prove that in order to go through. Otherwise, in some cases, Lynda, they won't let you stay. And in some cities, we're hearing even if you're a renter and you've signed a lease, well, if you're not an owner, you can't go back to that dwelling.
David, I'm wondering what sort of impact this is having on the economy, because it's not just the big businesses that have been effectively shut down, factories shut down, supply lines impacted, but we've also seen major tourist destinations closed. and flights cancelled.
You are, and this is the frustration that has been expressed by the foreign ministry in particular. And a lot of blame early on was placed on the United States even, because the foreign ministry felt as though they led the way in isolating mainland China, if you will, by cutting off the travel to and from for a lot of folks, issuing these strict travel restrictions that then many other countries jumped on board with. And so China feels as though they're losing a lot of that revenue, which is in fact the case. And they're also trying to push back against that. And it's clearly a priority, because we saw earlier this week, Lynda, President Xi Jinping, who was on the front line, so to speak, albeit here in Beijing, wearing that mask and talking with hospital workers. And sure, he was stressing the need to continue to battle this virus and to contain it as best as possible. But in the same breath, he stressed stabilizing the economy. That shows you just how crucial it is for them here, because in many ways, that is social stability. So he's asking companies, please don't move forward with mass layoffs. If you're having issues with production, reach out. The country will step in and help you where you need that assistance.
And of course, there is more concern as this has spread throughout Asia. We have seen now the largest bank in Singapore with a confirmed case, and their reaction there. David, certainly there are ramifications right across the region.
And that's recognized here as well. In fact, that is something that the foreign ministry has tried to make well known, if you will. And state media has put that out there, that this is not just about mainland China hurting. A lot of these Chinese tourists are needed in other countries, quite frankly, from a financial perspective. They bring in billions around the world as they travel out. And a lot of those tours have come to a stop. We know that flights have come to a stop. And until that resumes, that money is not flowing outwards.
Absolutely. All right, David Culver in Beijing. I'm at Rovers in Yokohama. We know that you and your teams have been getting very little sleep, working day and night for weeks on end to bring us your reporting. And we really want you to know that we appreciate it here at Connect the World. Thanks so much. We'll speak to you again very soon. Well, coming up later in the show, the coronavirus outbreak reaches the world of sports as China is forced to postpone the anticipated Grand Prix, which is scheduled for April. We're going to have more on that in about 30 minutes' time. And of course, you can keep up with all the latest developments on the coronavirus. That's on our website. Just go to CNN.com